Good morning. My name is Oля Peneva, and I'm the founder of the business, Bulgarian Business and Human Rights Foundation. We are an organization that works in informing and bringing more awareness on the business and human rights agenda in Bulgaria. I'm very pleased to have two remarkable guests here with me. Mr. Barт Devos from the Responsible Business Alliance and Miss Reychъl Дейвис, who is the founder and vice president of the Shift organization. I'll tell you in a moment a little bit more about them. First of all, want to say a big thank you for agreeing to joining this conversation about the CSDDD or the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the developments and the different perspective of your organization. So welcome. So we'll start with Barт Девос, who, as I said, is the is representative of the Responsible Business Alliance. He is the vice president of public policy, and before joining the RBA, he was the European sustainability manager for Samsung Electronics. He held different positions in different roles in both public sector and non-profit organizations. He's also has legal background, speaks numerous languages, and now you're working with business. So tell us a little bit more about the Responsible Business Alliance and its role with the due diligence process.
Thank you and good morning. It's a pleasure to join you today. The Responsible Business Alliance, in fact, who and what we are is we are one of the biggest global industry sustainability initiatives. So we are a coalition of companies that came together to collaborate around implementing sustainability in their supply chains. We were created by now actually almost 2 decades, more than 20 years ago, when initially a group of electronics manufacturing, so ICT manufacturing companies came together to collaborate in this space of how do we resolve the challenge of making our supply chains more responsible, more sustainable. And gradually we then also grew to cover other sectors. So today you also find industry sectors like automotive, manufacturing sector, retail, toy. And for most of those sectors, you'll see that our membership includes most of the global leading companies in that space, meaning that we have today over 600 companies that make in total and combined annual revenue of over $8 trillion USD. So a huge footprint that really allows us to do what we're good at, which is creating that collaborative approach to due diligence. What we do specifically in that space is we try to make sure that while due diligence is something that companies have to lead individually and design for each company individually tailored to the risks of each company, that we allow them to leverage the efficiency and the effectiveness element of doing some of those things in the collective. So companies come together and set one collective standards to then implement across their supply chains to be more efficient and more effective. They create collectively developed tools and standards. So think, for example, of risk assessment tools, audits, worker voice and grievance mechanisms, corrective action, reporting tools. All of those are tools that companies can develop on their own, but you create a huge efficiency and more effectiveness if you coordinate for companies to do this in the collective. And what is especially important in the context of due diligence when you think, how can a company truly have impact in making its supply chain more efficient? Often we talk about very complex contexts where companies have to work with different suppliers, hundreds of suppliers, thousands of suppliers deep down in the supply chain. And when working alone, a company may not have the leverage it needs to be effective in resolving an issue. So it's also that element of making companies come together so they have the leverage to address complex issues like sustainability in the supply chain. So our role with regards to the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, it's a long name for a law, is to help implement those requirements, not becoming those to which companies shift their responsibility, but help companies have the tools and the platforms they need to implement some part of those provisions.
So
the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is a complex thing. So let me perhaps also explain a little bit, like how it relates to RBA by explaining what exactly is in there. First of all, the directive is actually about creating an EU-wide standard for responsible business conduct. So what this directive is all about is describing how companies should address the impacts they have on the environment and the planet. It is a very complex thing, but it is based on existing international standards that have for some years now explained how this looks like conceptually. Where you have to address your sustainability impacts is very clearly defined in the directive. It's not just the supply chain, it's actually based on referring back to a definition of value chain and wider activities linked to the operations of a company. So if you imagine the typical supply chain, value chain of an ICT member company, what we are talking about, what a company has to address is really going from, for example, the mineral stage of the supply chain, the impact the company has through its raw material sourcing, the raw materials that go into the manufacturing, then the actual manufacturing, including the tier 1, 2, 3 down in the supply chain, those impacts that you have in the manufacturing of components and then the final product, but then also the actual final assembly of your product and its transportation and possibly things like the storage and disposal of certain, in certain cases, of your product. What the law does, there is 3 very basic foundational things. First of all, the law says this is how a company has to do due diligence. So these are the steps of due diligence. Then it also introduces the concept of liability. So making companies under certain cases and under certain conditions liable if still, despite the due diligence, impacts happen on sustainability by operations of the company or business activities related to the company. And then third, the directive also introduces climate-related obligations, so setting an obligation for companies to have a climate mitigation plan.
Thank you very much. This is a really good opening and understanding of what the RBA does. And so I understand from what you're saying that the RBA supports the adoption of the CSDDD from one perspective. But one thing that I wanted to ask you is one concern that we're hearing often and often is regarding the administrative burden that companies will have to face when this directive is adopted. Can you please tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We support very clearly the adoption of EU CSDDD of this directive. We think it makes business sense. It provides companies with one clear EU-wide standard with certainty on what's expected from them. Secondly, it's also just the right thing to do because it requires companies to gradually address the negative sustainability impacts they have. And third, because it is a law that is fully based on existing international standards that companies have experience with in implementing. So yes, the administrative burden is a concern that we should talk about, but we think that overall, when you look at the final version of this law, we are talking about the law that hits the balance right. So when we talk about these industry concerns, like, for example, administrative burden, it's really important to realize that the outcome, the final version of this law, is a compromise. And that means that it's a carefully crafted balance between the need to protect human rights globally and also the need to really realistically listen to what we can expect from companies and to listen to industry to address those concerns. So yes, there are ambitious elements in the law, but overall, the outcome really has been watered down so that the final law is workable for companies. And throughout those 2 years of negotiations, industry has been very deeply involved, has had a real influence over those negotiations, and their concerns have been taken on board through input, for example, from organizations like mine, but also many others. So when it comes to burden, we actually don't think that the burden on companies is unmanageable or that the administrative burden is disproportionate. First of all, because companies are not required to address all their impacts. They can prioritize based on the risk-based approach. So companies can assess what are the most severe, most likely risks in my supply chain or value chain, then prioritize the most severe, most likely. So they're not supposed to address everything at once, but they can prioritize. Second, the directive actually also lets companies be resource efficient by allowing companies to use collectively developed tools and by working through industry schemes. So that means that companies are not supposed to develop all their own tools or to verify the value chain by themselves, or companies are not supposed to each separately have their own audits. They can pool resources, share the effort through industry initiatives, and in that way be more efficient. And third and last, the directive does not, like CSRD or other EU legislation, introduce new or many new reporting requirements. It's really a law that says this is how we ask companies to act on due diligence.
Great. Thank you very much for this. And just one more question. I heard so much about collaboration and working together. So just to understand, for companies that are concerned that they haven't started on the process, what will be the support, if you can just briefly tell us in terms of the different tools and what can happen in the next couple of years?
So I would say there is a ton of available resources, first of all, to help companies understand the basics about how the concept of due diligence functions and what concretely, practically is expected from companies. And organizations like Shift, but many others that are the thought leaders and the guardians of those existing frameworks can point you to all those many existing guidances that exist. Second, I would say companies that do not know where to start, join industry collaborative initiatives like RBA exists for our sector. Most other sectors also have their own industry collaborative initiative, or even better, multi-stakeholder initiative. And joining those will help you understand what are the risks typically for you as a company in your sector, what concretely are other companies in your sector doing, and then discover the many existing tools that you can use for your own due diligence. And then beyond joining industry initiatives, talk to your peers, connect with professionals at peer companies, and keep in mind, no one expects you to have a perfect supply chain. The law expects you to understand your supply chain, to understand the risks it features, and to gradually address those risks through existing tools, through existing approaches, but no one expects you to have an impact-free value chain tomorrow. That's not even the case for probably the most mature companies within industry schemes. One last thing I would add is the perspective of SMEs, small companies. We know that due diligence is not easy for small companies. First of all, many small companies are not in scope of the law, actually none are. Some mid-sized companies will likely be in scope of the law, but for those the law foresees additional, very specific, customized support measures, financial support, and other guidances. So I really want to reassure that mid-sized companies will be specifically looked after during the implementation of this law.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this. Now we've covered some of the major aspects. We're moving forward with Ms. Reychъл Дейвис. As I said, she is the co-founder and vice president of Shift. It's an organization that every new business and human rights expert or everyone wants to know something about human rights, UNGPs, business. This is the go-to place. She has experience in working in this practical part of implementation. And most importantly, she's been involved in this process quite early because she was a legal advisor to the late Professor John Ruggie, who is actually the author of the United Nations Guiding Principles and the framework that we're working and trying to make so much to show how much sense there is and how good it is. So Reychъl, thank you. And I'll start with you and ask you, what was your role in drafting the UNGPs?
Thanks so much, Olia, and lovely to be here with you and with Bart. So my role was as part of a team supporting John. I was a legal advisor, and we were looking at all the different legal questions that came up in the process of drafting the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And this was back in 2005 to 2011. And I think what's important for people who aren't familiar with the UN Guiding Principles to understand is that They were not just a European standard or a standard that we sort of made up as a theoretical approach and hoped it might work. We actually tested all of the core elements in the guiding principles with a wide range of stakeholders, including business, over a number of years, so that when they were endorsed by the UN in 2011, they came with a lot of support and practical experience already embedded in them. And we've just seen that grow in the last decade since they were adopted. The guiding principles are about how business should respect people's basic dignity in the different ways in which business can impact them through its own operations and its value chain, as you've heard Bart lay out in the context of the directive. Everybody wants to be respected. That's a very basic human desire. We're all the same in that regard. And the guiding principles were important because I think there was already clarity for business on what to do to manage certain governance risks like corruption or environmental risks. I think businesses know if your products are inherently risky, like chemicals, you have special controls in place. Everybody has systems in place for managing pollution. You know, these things were already familiar to business, but what to do about human rights risks beyond labor rights, respecting labor rights in your own workplace, was new. And what the guiding principles did was say that companies need to make reasonable efforts to prevent and address the impacts that they're connected to. And that's really the best way to have the best outcomes for people in terms of health and safety, livelihoods, respecting the rights of women and children, but it's also good for business. We see lots of evidence about how this leads to increased retention. It makes businesses the partner of choice, the investment of choice. It also helps with productivity and efficiency, reliability in the supply chain. So there's many reasons why we've seen businesses voluntarily start implementing the UN guiding principles. And I should also mention the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct as well, for multinational enterprises, and the guidance that supports them on responsible business conduct. These two standards are at the heart of the directive. And of course, in Bulgaria's case, it makes sense to look to OECD standards on this topic.
Great, thank you so much for this. So now we've covered the umbrella standard. One thing that we're noticing, and you know quite well, is we have so many standards. And for business, one of the concerns is we have the ESG disclosures. It's connected with the corporate responsibility, corporate sustainability reporting directive. And for many companies, this feels like isn't that enough? This is just another standard, and we've already covered the human rights in the social component. What are your thoughts on that?
So we are very clear that what is at the base of the new EU sustainability reporting standards and the ESG requirements for investors as well, it is the same set of expectations. It's the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. So actually, we just have one set of standards, the international standards, and then a specific application in the context of reporting, and now a specific application in the context of what we expect companies to do, as Bart said. And I think it's logical, right? It makes sense that if you're going to have to report on these matters anyway, and if investors are going to analyze your performance on the basis of your alignment with the international standards, then you may as well get some credit for doing the underlying sustainability due diligence. And I think that's what the CSDDD is trying to achieve. It's saying we expect companies to do the due diligence, but we'll also recognize that where they do, where they're making reasonable efforts, as I said, then they're likely to be a more reliable business partner, a better investment choice, and so on.
Okay, thank you so much for this. And so you mentioned a few times that the CSDDD is aligned with international standards, and it's good news, right? But why? And one thing, again, I'm going back to standards, regulations. So how really good is it to have this kind of one standard or aligned with standards?
Absolutely. And it's important to ask because at Shift, we're a non-profit, mission-driven organization that promotes the international standards. So of course we think it's good. But what are the reasons for that? Why do we think it's good? I think there are probably three to call out now. The first is that it will level the playing field. The directive will make sure that all companies are asking the same things of their business partners. At the moment, there are many different questionnaires and self-assessments and audits on ESG issues, and investors are using all kinds of different methodologies, and no one really knows what's in that black box. And with the CS3D, we should be able to have, or companies should be able to have, one set of answers for everybody. It meets reporting requirements, it meets the due diligence expectations, it meets what investors are asking them. It's a single set of answers, and that will help level the playing field. The second reason, as we've touched on a bit already, is that the expectations in the directive, because they're based on the international standards, are reasonable. As Bart said, this is not about companies controlling all their risks or tackling everything at once. You can prioritize where you need to be effective. And we know that many companies, already feel that compliance with what exists is a lot, and they're managing that. But we've seen really effective results from even smaller companies picking a particular issue, like low wages in their own supply chain, and going after that, because it can have many knock-on positive effects for other social and human rights issues. So again, this is not about trying to do everything all at once, but it is about making meaningful effort on the most severe risks that you can be connected to. And the third reason is that certainly what we hope at Shift is that the directive should discourage blaming, cost shifting, cutting and running, some of these pretty poor behaviors that we've seen in how companies have managed human rights and social risks in their value chains and with business partners. This often happens now, but it shouldn't. It's not what we want, and it's not what the international standards emphasize. They really create this expectation of engaging with business partners to try to actually tackle risks meaningfully and get better outcomes for workers, for local communities. So I think again, this point that the CS3D will require particularly support and capacity building to SMEs. As Bart said, they are not, or certainly small companies are not directly in scope. Medium companies, some medium companies maybe, but if you're an SME and you're affected in the supply chain, there's very specific provisions for how your business partners need to take account of that and provide you with resources to meet these expectations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. My last question is regarding support. We've heard what the RBA is doing, and we know that you're doing quite a lot of work in terms of different tools. We also in Bulgaria, we are identifying the capacity building component. And as I introduced to you, our first model on business and human rights, which is available through the ESG Academy. So we are moving in this direction. So what else would you say is out there for support everyone who is thinking of going in this direction?
Absolutely. The first thing I think we'd say is that for companies that are newer to this, breathe. It's okay. There's time. The legislation allows time for companies to put their house in order and to get up to speed with the resources that exist. And importantly, and this is something we've been exchanging about earlier, that there needs to be more resources translated into locally available languages. I think Bulgaria was very lucky to have the ESG Academy, to have the work that you and others are doing, to have a local expert business and human rights organization that's already sort of a step ahead. You can help with meeting some of that need and providing some of that connection to existing resources. There are quite a lot of free resources out there, including particularly the UN Global Compact's Academy course on implementing human rights due diligence. That's being translated into an increasing number of languages. Obviously, we need to add more to that list. But I think with the adoption of the directive, we'll certainly see, and the directive itself provides for this, resources being invested into the development of authoritative guidance, drawing on what already exists.
Great. Thank you so much. I think because we're finishing our time, and I think it's important to finish off with one question that I've been asking for myself for the last few weeks, and this is why we initiated this conversation with you. And I'll start with you, Rachel. What happens if this directive doesn't go through? What are the outcomes that we can see?
So, I mean, three things are going to stay the same, which is that the expectations of business partners and investors are not going away, the international standards are not going away, and sustainability risks are not going away. If anything, they're increasing. So what we're going to have is all the same things, expectations, standards, and risk, but without an agreed framework, without regulatory certainty on how to manage them, which we think leaves everybody worse off. So we really see the directive as an opportunity for business, civil society, trade unions, governments to really come together and coalesce around a clear, shared, predictable standard. And we really hope that everyone will take this opportunity.
Great, thank you so much. Bart, I'll ask you the same question. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Rachel said the most important, but it's clear that the uncertainty for industry will continue. If the law doesn't pass, that will be because of technical concerns on specific provisions raised by some governments and by blocking minorities within other governments. But there is a clear, overwhelming political majority in favor of mandatory due diligence. There will be continuation of legislative attempts and eventually new legislation in this space. So the uncertainty will just continue for industry, but the momentum will not go away. Second, future legislation may not get it right, like CSDDD did. The workable outcome that Rachel and me just have been talking about, the outcome of those years of negotiations that effectively onboarded industry concerns, tried to make something manageable for industry, that may not be the case when future legislation comes through. And then third, of course, companies trying to do the right thing will just continue to face unfair competition from unethical companies. So this would effectively be a setback for those companies already trying to do the right thing. Now, one other thing I also perhaps want to reflect on to end is, what does this mean if the law doesn't happen for SMEs? I think when you look today at the role of SMEs and due diligence, indeed there are concerns, because indeed there is an unfortunate trend where often buyer companies, large companies, will just cascade down expectations on SME, the smaller suppliers. So often SMEs are on the receiving end of burdensome, inefficient requirement, administrative questionnaires, and CSDDD could perfectly fix this, because CSDDD on one hand obliges the companies in scope of the law, the larger companies, to be responsible in the way they engage SMEs. The law effectively, actually explicitly mandates those large buying companies to be responsible in the way they engage SMEs and provide support. And second, by harmonizing the requirements, the law will directly lead to harmonization in the requests that SMEs receive, so that an SME does no longer receive 20 different requests from 20 different buyers. So all those positive effects that SMEs could see from the law taking effect will disappear. And for SMEs, the picture of due diligence and the impact it has on SMEs will probably continue to be a burdensome and an uncoordinated one. So I really think that the advantages are clear. I'm not so positive about what happens if the directive does not pass, but I'm still confident that lawmakers will get this right, and that we will, in some years from now, benefit from those positive effects of the directive.
Great, thank you so much both for this conversation. I will have to say that from our organization, we feel that this support is extremely needed. This conversation is timely, even though we're just a few days away from a really big decision, but really having the expertise, the local expertise and mentorship and guidance from organizations and professionals like you for us is extremely important. And we've heard so many good things in favor of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in terms of supply chain, value chain. We've heard more about the UNGPs and their role as an international standard, which from a voluntary is becoming a more actually mandatory standard. We're seeing the benefits. We are also seeing quite a few concerns, but it's important for everybody to know that we are looking everything as holistically, or in a bigger picture. Nobody's looking at this element separately. So I really would like to end it here and to thank you both for your time. Unless you have something else to say in the end, if not, we can just finish here.
Thank you, Olia, for initiating the conversation.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Bart.